So I'm very happy, Pamela, that you agreed to join us today. So I'm Stefan Konermann. My name is Stefan Konermann. I'm the spokesperson of the Cluster of Excellence, and I'm really happy to see you today. And I'm really looking forward to your talk. Let me give the audience some very short information on you. Pamela is a specialist on the Qing Empire and modern Chinese history, and she also researches and writes on Central and Inner Asian history, global history, the history of horsemanship in Eurasia before the modern period, and the imperial sources of modern identities. She is the author of 8 books. One is forthcoming, China's Global Empire, Qing, 1637 until 1912. And among other publications, I want to mention Hammer and Anvil, Nomad Rulers at the Forge of the Modern World, which was published in 2019. Then a book on the Manchus, and a book with a very promising title, What is Global History, published in 2008. And she co-authored 2 leading textbooks on global history, and one on the empire at the margins, culture, ethnicity, and frontier in early and modern China. Shorter research works have appeared or will appear in the Cambridge History of China, the Cambridge History of World Slavery. That is where I know you from, of course, from the Cambridge History of World Slavery, and the Cambridge History of Warfare. Her work was several times awarded by prizes. For example, the Joseph Levenson Prize of the Association for Asian Studies, or the Dartmouth Award for Outstanding Scholarly or Creative Achievement. Here information that I found on your homepage that is very interesting. Your article, Outside In, Power, Identity, and the Han Lineage of Jishu, has recently been cited as one of the 15 best articles published in the journal in its 50-year history. And it's the only article written by a specialist from outside the medieval Chinese history field. And last but not least, Pamela is also a software author. That is very interesting, especially for us. Maybe we can talk about this this qualification, not now, but I think separately. She's also a software author and scholarly editor of the ECCP Reader, a desktop access point to the famous reference work Eminent Chinese of the Qing period, with parallel channels of recent research and commentary. And she is the author of teaching devices used in her courses, including the Dexo Reader, which is freely available. Pamela, thank you again for coming today virtually, and we are really looking forward to your talk, Dependency and the Mirage of Ethnicity. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Konermann. I would like very much to meet that person that you just introduced. She sounds very interesting. I first of all want to thank you so much for the invitation today. I really am honored by that. And I decided to try something. I don't know how it will work. I hope it will work all right. The talk today is very large scale. Some things I will not be covering in much depth because I want to fit pieces together. And maybe afterwards in the questions, we could go into more depth about some of the points. So I apologize for kind of zooming through various of these things. I'm trying to put together things I have already published with things I'm working on now and hope to publish in the future. I do see kind of an arc here. And actually, I think it relates maybe best to what Professor Konermann mentioned, the last of the thematic interest for me, which is the imperial origins of modern identities. So I think if we think of it in terms of that arc, probably be most helpful. So I'm now going to start sharing my screen This is the overall sort of structure of it. I'm going to try to start very quickly and then get to the early modern period, and then late 19th century is kind of critical, and then the 20th century academic discourse that creates a kind of retrospective on the early modern period is quite interesting to me. So by way of introduction, I wanted to point out that, I mean, some of you will know that since 1990, I have been complaining about the ways in which historians sometimes use this word ethnic. Of course, it means something different in each context. So I'm not making a kind of blanket or undifferentiated criticism of everybody who uses the word, but there was, I noticed in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, a tendency to import this concept from sociology and anthropology into history, which I think had certain problems I'll refer to later. But then I noticed also that beginning probably in very early 21st century, what has happened in my field and some others, I think too, is that this idea of ethnic or ethnicity has been universalized so that it now includes the kinds of identities that I think previously we would not have described as ethnic. And I think this has had a deleterious, a very damaging effect on our ability to describe the historical processes behind the emergence of modern identities. And of most concern to me is obscuring of the role of conquest, occupation, domination in the early modern period on our contemporary concepts of identity. So to just, I mean, this is one of those things I'm just going to skip over. Of course, the mechanisms by which early states ascribed and enforced identities were originally most closely related to slavery and various kinds of dependency. This is, I think, something that we all know as a fact. I think it sometimes gets forgotten a little bit in the way that people use this word ethnicity today. In the medieval period, I think in this book, Hammer and Anvil, that I published in 2019, I was able to get up only to about the beginning of the 17th century, but it's a process by which there's a shift from medieval practices of identity ascription to what's happening in kind of the threshold to the early modern period, where states can take on a different kind of role in the ascription, the historicization, the enforcement of identities, the ways in which they are objectifying identities. And what I suggested in the book was that as you get towards the 15th, 16th centuries, and the scope here is Eurasia, right? I mean, I don't say anything, I don't know anything about Africa or the Americas or Australia. It's about Eurasia as a working unit. It seemed to me that through the medieval period, there were various trends that states were able to draw upon in the early modern period. One was from Central Asia. And the histories of conquest there, in which captive peoples or people who are otherwise dependent were often given cultural labels for various reasons. One was that it was a way of recording the history of the gifting of peoples. These are people who are literally being owned by the aristocrats, gifting of them from the ruler or the rendering of them to the ruler through tribute. The cultural labels were actually a good way of keeping track of the history of that. More than that, I think, as you see going through the medieval period, use of these labels becomes a way of describing the emergence of rulership, right? So that using a genitive case kind of construction, you would be the king of the English, or let's say. Of course, the English didn't call themselves the English themselves, but this is a way of historicizing this population so that you know who's the king of that, right? And so what you see as you move towards this age of very large scale conquest in the early modern period is these things begin to accrete, right? So that if you're looking, as we'll be looking later, at the beginnings of, let's say, the Romanov Empire in Russia, or the beginnings of Ottomans, or the beginnings of the Qing Empire in Eastern Asia, that you kind of pile these things together, right? So you start to see these titles emerging in which somebody is the king of this population, and the Khan of that population, and the Basileus of some other population. These are all dependent states that are being described through these cultural labels. Of course, the aristocrats, being not dependents in this the way I'm speaking of, don't have cultural labels in the Middle Ages. They speak the languages that are the sort of lingua franca because of their religious affiliations, and this allows them to speak to aristocrats in other areas with whom they're planning to marry or merge territory or whatever it is. I mean, the reference points for aristocrats are the institutions of aristocracy and not these cultural labels, right, which in the Eurasian Middle Ages, right, tend to be for dependent peoples. An example of this, again, Professor Kuhneman very kindly referred to this article outside in that I did on this population, this lineage of the Khitan Liao period, called the, we have to call them something, so we just call them the Han. Han is a surname, the Han of Jizhou. And the historiography of that was that for decades, historians were trying to retrospectively impose upon this lineage some kind of a label. I mean, they are of partial Chinese descent, but they are very powerful in the Khitan Liao system. And so who are they? So as 20th century historians, we want to come up with these terms like Khitanized Chinese or Sinicized Khitans. Or, I mean, we have to impose these kind of ethnic qualities to identities that in their own time probably this just really wasn't part of it. They were Khitan aristocrats. And that's really kind of an absolute in terms of describing their identities. Here I'm showing actually the tomb, the recently excavated tomb of the most famous member of this lineage, Han Dezhang. This is one of those points at which archaeology is coming in to correct the record for us. In this case, we can see that, in fact, this tomb is entirely not in the Chinese style. This is a very characteristic of Khitan aristocrats. The grave goods, the grave design, all the aspects of material culture are simply those of a Khitan aristocrat and not of somebody who in their own time would be struggling to figure out, am I Han? Am I Han Chinese? Am I some kind of a Khitan? What am I? It simply wasn't something that was happening. But in the 20th century, historians really felt a compulsion to try to go back and, figure this all out. I think another source besides Central Asia was the Islamic world, where from the time that states begin to be built in the 7th century, this ascription of identity is really one of the foundations of state activity, partly because you have to distinguish who is a Muslim, who is not, who is, who are people of the book, the Al-Dimah. They have to be also recognized. Pagans have to be identified because, they have to be converted or they have to be eradicated or whatever. And so the bureaucratization of these kind of processes, I think, was a very important kind of antecedent, right? It's a source for things that are happening in the early modern period in others of these states. So the cumulative impact, right, by the time you get to the early modern period for states across Eurasia, and that does include Europe, is kind of drawing on these Central Asian traditions before the Mongols that were nevertheless very well known through Europe and Central Asia and Eastern Eurasia, and then also the Mongol conquests as a kind of second layer, right, of this impact, and then these kind of institutions that were already very, very well developed in the Islamic world that could later be generalized by way of this objectification of identity that, in my view, was characteristic of these conquest states. So overland conquest and ascription of identity, one of the points I actually have a text that goes with this that I don't want to read the text to you because that's terrible to do that, but in the text I'm able to go into a lot more detail. A lot of times when we talk about the impact of imperialism up on whatever cultures, societies, and so on of the early modern period, we're talking about the maritime empires of Europe. And I think, that's one kind of impact. I think the impact of the overland empires of Eurasia is, first of all, much greater because it affects a much larger number of people. But I think there are also institutions coming out of it that have been more definitive of the modern approaches to objectification of identity. Now, overland conquest, what the maritime empires can do is they can look around, or they can explore around, and they can identify little parts of the world that would be profitable for them to colonize. So there's resources, or there are populations they can enslave, or whatever it is, and they can put their resources into defining and occupying some select territories that will actually have at least the potential to be very profitable. The overland empires could not do it like that. They had to expand on a strategic basis, basically, defending the boundaries that they have. And it means that they are tending to absorb populations in situ, right? So you're bringing these populations in. These are, for the most part, these are settled agricultural populations. They can be very dense populations. And so what we see, whether it's the Qing or it's the Russian Empire or it's the Ottomans, is that as this happens, as there is overland expansion, there is, number one, a kind of impact on the rulership. I'll go into that in a second, but there is also this requirement on the part of the state to establish criteria of identity and to respond to strategic requirements over the course of time. So let's say in the very early part of the very earliest stage of the expansion of these empires, it's very important to transform conquered peoples into conquerors. They have to become agents of further conquest. And so this means that the rulership must respond by way of being able to represent those peoples and to historicize them. They have to be historicized as agents of conquest. Once these empires have reached their greatest extension, what you tend to see is that there's a shift towards trying to stabilize the criteria of status. And again, genealogies become very important. The links of individuals to the populations that have been agents of conquest is very important. And so again, distinguishing between the conquered and the conquerors is a very important part of what the state is doing. In all these cases, it happens, and I don't think this is a coincidence, that you have heritable military dependency in the Qing Bannerman, in the Russian Bannerman, in the various of the Ottoman classes, not only the Janissaries, but the Askari and various others of these, that hereditary military dependency becomes one of those things recognized by the state and eventually bureaucratized to a certain extent. Now, this is a sidelight here. This is the impact of these conquest processes on the rulerships. I've written a lot about this, and I will be writing more about this, but it's not really what I want to talk about today, except to establish that this public representation of what are now culturally labeled histories, right, is essential to the way that these empires of overland conquest operated. So you have to have this representative vocabulary of ritual and monumental presentation, usually through orthography, and sort of symbolic dress, the posing, and so on, in order to be able to represent, again, the histories of these peoples who are agents of conquest. So these are just little examples. Here's, Nicholas II dressed up like a Cossack. This is one of the things that he would do is, when he's handing out their wages and so on. Of course, the Ottoman emperors were famous for doing that also with respect to the Janissaries. But in this case, I was really interested in this representation of that could be Murad, maybe the second. That this is an unusual representation of an Ottoman sultan who is not in the pose of a caliph, let's say, or even of a leading Muslim, but in this case as a kind of warrior, as a mounted archer. In other words, as a Turk. Which is not altogether common for the Ottomans. And again, when the Ottomans do this, the same as when the Qing emperors represent themselves as Manchu, it's not because as the emperor, they are Manchus. As the emperor, they are actually transcendent over these cultural identities. But because at that moment, he's embodying, right, he's personating the Manchus. And so when the Ottomans do this, it's not because they see themselves as Turks, not before the 19th century anyway, but that in this case, he's actually representing himself as a Turk because that's an important part of this mosaic structure of the empire itself. So the point here is that in all these cases, the public representation of these identities within, these personae, within the rulership, actually are able to be translated to a kind of inculcation of these identities to the populations, selected populations. And I think that the fact that this is happening in the early modern period is something to note because of the technological resources available to these rulerships that they really didn't have in medieval or ancient times. I think print, not the technology of printing itself, but the total sort of ability to acquire paper and ink and instill a certain amount of popular education and, the technical abilities to reprint a text, hundreds, thousands of times is part of what these empires are able to take advantage of in the historicization of these populations, in the construction and the kind of enforcement of these criteria of identity. So just as examples of this, right, in the 18th century, you have this massive publication campaign, particularly in the time of the Qianlong Emperor, in which there are constructed narratives imposed for the Manchus, for the Mongols, for Tibet as a place more than anything else, for selected Uyghur lineages, and of course for the Chinese population, which has a very careful kind of representation in Qing historiography. The same thing in the case of the Ottomans. This is interesting. I sort of mark this as the last point here, but it really feeds over into all of these. In the Ottoman case, you have at an early point narrative of the origins of the imperial lineage. And that was also very important in Romanov historiography, and in fact, in the historiography of Muscovy before that. And in the Qing case, this is also very important, the origins of the imperial lineage. But over time, and I think this happens earliest in the Ottomans, you begin to see a new kind of narrative building, and in this case of the Turks themselves. In the Ottoman case of the Oghuz Turks, the groups that would eventually be called Turkmen, that this begins to emerge in the historiography as a kind of a separate thread. Then I think in the case of somebody like Nicholas I and his official nationality policies, the early 19th century, you can see this kind of coming to fruition. The Romanovs had not previously represented themselves as Russian, particularly. They were representing themselves as having this sort of complex, sort of Scandinavian, Germanic origin. But in the 19th century, there is this tendency of the rulerships to try to merge their own imperial narrative with that of what they're seeing as the dominant group. And it's a thing, it's a new sort of thing that emerges out of this. The Qing also attempt this, but it never works for them, but it was not completely successful for the Ottomans or for the Romanovs either, but they were a little more successful at it than Qing was. So the point is that these personae within the rulerships that emerge out of overland conquest all correspond to a constructed audience, right, within the population of people who, by language, by history, by custom, are connected to that particular narrative of conquest, particularly being agents of conquest. So for me, the critical point here, it comes at the late 19th century, in which we're now having a kind of distillation of these identities. In other words, we've got to a point really in all these, let's say these three empires I'm looking at now, where we're seeing the end of the empire. And these empires, remember, do all end within 10 years of each other in the early part of the 20th century. But in the 19th century, particularly later 19th century, you can see opinion emerging not only within the academy, but also in popular opinion that something has to come after this empire. And every one of these empires has been built upon the principle of basically moving populations around, giving them specific kind of roles in the conquest, using the emperorship itself as a means of facilitating the peaceful coexistence, as it were, of these different communities with each other. But when the empire is gone, right, who will still be here? And what has struck me in the past is that in the later part of the 19th century, you see that certain populations can narrate themselves as inevitable. In other words, we will still be here after the empire is gone. And the ability to do that, I think, has various origins, but one of them are the resources that have been supplied by the empire itself. So cultural populations within the empires who over time have had their histories narrated, their languages institutionalized in the educational structures, also in the publishing. You have to be able to publish primers and dictionaries in order to standardize the language, make it accessible to everyone. All of these empires also sponsored the publication of geographical histories, right, in which they could place certain populations in certain kinds of homelands and then describe, what's happening to them as they're joining the progress of the conquest and so on. Those kinds of populations are the ones who are able to narrate themselves as inevitable. They will still be here after the empire. Now we have also peoples, and I'll actually look at this a little more carefully in a second, who are not in that category. Let's say in the case of China, of Qing China, we have basically 5 populations who are in that category. And then we have hundreds of others, maybe thousands, who have not had their identities objectified through the imperial educational and publishing and historicizing projects, right? Instead, they've been the objects of programs of forced assimilation. And the expectation on the part of the populations who are narrating themselves as inevitable is that these other populations are contingent. They will eventually be assimilated. They won't, they won't become the source for new national cultures. So in the later part of the 19th century, I think partly we have communities that on their own resources are able to find coherence and are able to foresee a kind of future of living in somebody else's country, but maybe still living as a community. These are these contingent sort of populations. Now, to give an example of why I think this is important, I look here at China. We're thinking of China here, let's say, end of the Qing in 1912, a few years before that, or a few years after that. What we have in the late part of the 19th century are nationalist movements, which, while the empire is still there, these are secessionist movements. These are nationalist movements that are based upon these populations whose narratives have been constituent parts of the emperorship. And as a consequence, they have been objectified through historicizing, through monumental representation, ritual representation, shaping of the educational institutions around the teachings of their languages and their histories and geographies. The nationalist movements in this period in China, let's say after 1890, all correspond to the populations that had been objectified in this way during the Qing period and had been actually seen as personae within the rulership. The hundreds of other people who were living in Qing China did not have nationalist separatist movements, and nobody expected them to have nationalist separatist movements. Instead, the discourse was all about how those little groups might live in new entities that would be created by these other peoples. So the Mongols here, the Turkestani populations in the Northwest, Tibet here, and of course, China itself. Because the Chinese had been narrated during the Qing period. And of course, their language, their culture, and so on had been very heavily objectified at the same time. So the question here is, what about all these other people who were never objectified in that way, but instead are represented through something like this? This is a page from the this catalog of the Qing period, of the Huangqing Zhigongtu, of these peoples, both within the borders of the empire and from outside the empire, who are the sort of tribute-bearing populations. They are actually, they're given these descriptions, they're giving these depictions. The peoples who are imperial constituencies, let's put it that way, are not in this collection. So the Manchus are not here, but others of the traditional peoples of the Northeast are here, right? The Khalkha Mongols are not here, but others of Mongol groups who are seen as not central, right? As marginal, as on the edges. In other words, these categories, as we get towards the end of the 19th century, that I have previously called, and I will in later publications call, inevitable on the one hand and contingent on the other, were for most of the 20th century represented in sociological and historical discourse as national and ethnic. There was a distinction that was pretty carefully observed and was able to represent these power differentials. Why is this important? Well, here's an example from the Qing that I like. Let's contrast for a moment the Manchus on the one hand and the Hui on the other. Now, the Manchus is this military population, comes in with the Qing, been objectified for the whole period. Their language, their history, their role in the conquests, and as a sort of byproduct of this, the state was financially supporting Manchu communities. It was requiring education in their language and so on, publishing more than one important compendium on their history. And what we'll find in the case of the Manchus, according to me, is that for the earlier part of the Qing, the Manchus themselves are not generating a Manchu identity. They don't have to. The state is doing it for them. Even if they were doing it, you wouldn't be able to see it in historical evidence because the state is actually doing it instead. But in the 19th century, when the state, actually for various reasons, has to attenuate its support for the Manchus, then you find that there are, in fact, very small segments of the Manchu population who do create these kind of self-generated communities that have a distinct identity. And they have the resources for that. And in fact, as you go into the 20th century, there's a very small kind of independence movement in the Northeast around the 1910. But more important, this actually becomes the basis for this kind of false national narrative of Manchukuo, right? It becomes an extension of Japanese imperialism in the earlier part of the 20th century. Now, the point is that the Manchus are understood as an inevitable identity, that there's a national history there to be utilized. It may be utilized by Manchus themselves or people who are going to identify themselves with Manchuria in order to be able to argue for secessionist movements, or it could be utilized in this case by Japanese imperialists who realize that there it is. There's the national narrative that's been generated in the imperial period, and if the Manchus themselves aren't going to use it, we can use it. In the meantime, there were these movements, as you saw from the map, in Mongolia, in the Northwest, in Tibet, and of course China itself, that did result in actually national entities of one kind or another. Now, by contrast, here's the Hui, right? The Hui population in China are the Chinese-speaking Muslims. They have, this very long history going back to the Middle Ages. They in many cases, they were coherent communities within Qing society. They were in the north, in the south, and a little bit in the northwest. They were basically 2/3 of the entire Muslim population of Qing China. But unlike the Turkestani Muslims of the northwest, the Hui themselves were never narrated by the Qing as an entity. They were never given this role as agents of the conquest. Instead, they were often given this sort of strange characterization in Qing legal commentary as being sort of suspect, always suspects. So they are generating their own communities within which they do have their own linguistic practices and religious practices and food practices and so on. But they are never narrated as inevitable. As you get to the end of the Qing, you do not see any kind of a secessionist movement, a nationalist movement emerging among the Hui communities of Southeast China, Central China, and so on. And so, in fact, for most of the Qing period before the 19th century, the Hui are what we would regard as genuinely ethnic, right? They are having an ethnic experience. They have ethnic coherence within this larger society that is not their own society. The Manchus, on the other hand, are narrated as the foremost agents of conquest. And until the state support for that collapses in the latter part of the 19th century, they are not generating what we would see as ethnic communities. That only happens once they have lost this kind of power base within the state. Now, why do I think this is important? Well, let me go over what I see as part of the history of the origins of the academic discourse, the retrospective on all this. There is, from the, I would say 18th century on, 18th century, latter part of the 17th century in the case of the Qing onward, there's this really intimate connection between imperial sponsorship of academic enterprises and progress of overland conquest. And you can see this, I mean, the institutions that we find most recognizable, like the Imperial Academy at St. Petersburg, right, is there, but there are equivalents of that. No, there are cognates of that also in the Qing case, and certainly in the Ottoman case as well. So these are academic enterprises. Part of this has to do with these publishing programs I was speaking of before, relating to language, relating to history, relating to documentation and standardization of religious practices. All of those things are happening in connection with imperial sponsorship. And the content of what is being researched, what's being taught, is always in some correspondence with the actual on the ground progress of the conquest itself. And so this kind of objectification of native languages and practices and so on becomes part of kind of prehistory of social science. As I said, this is as I note here, this is the age in which we have the rise of these great linguistic preoccupations like Indo-Europeanism and Altaicism, and this idea that populations and languages grow and move together and differentiate, right, in relationship to each other, was very, very powerful, right? Today, because of DNA studies, we're a little bit skeptical of that, but this was a really credible thing all the way up through the latter part of the 20th century. Cavalli Sforza was, he was just convinced about this. The criteria of nationality coming out of this and forming these early theories of nationality, language, ancestry, religion, and then this idea of vicinage. Either we're all living in the same vicinity or we came from a certain homeland. These are the criteria that were used by the empires for their purposes of conquest and occupation in the 17th, 18th century. These were their criteria. They become nativized within this certain academic spectrum that I'll look at here in connection with Herder. So Herder, interesting to me because we see him as seminal in this idea of nationality, history, language, sensibility. Not only sensibilities deriving from history, supposedly, but also connected to language and this aesthetics, perception, and that there are cognates of this all over Eurasia. And just as a footnote I'm not going into, I think this has to do with a generalized kind of continental shift towards materialist philosophy in the sort of 16th and 17th centuries. So here's Herder, right? So we're always saying Herder is central, Herder is central. But I didn't usually find that people were putting him within what I think is the correct context, which is this sort of German and also partly French-based academic milieu that integrated the major centers within Romanov Russia with these other centers, mostly in Germany and then, of course, in Vienna, and so on, within this sort of yellow zone here. This is more or less, Herder starts in Riga. That's where he's starting his academic career. A lot of his earliest ideas about language and religion and objectification of these identities come right out of Riga, Königsberg. This is actually all this Russian academic milieu that, as I'm saying, is shaped by the dynamics of overland conquest. But in this case, the vehicle for it is the German and French academic spheres, which keeps it very intimately connected with Central Europe here. And again, going back to this book that I published, Hammer and Anvil, it was the main argument of that book that, in fact, the precursors of early modern thought, particularly skepticism and scientific thinking, are basically from this zone, because this is where, until the 16th century, I would say, this was the connecting point of Europe and Eurasia generally. It's what kept Europe organically connected to the rest of Eurasia. And so to me, this is sort of one of the main lines of transmission of these Eurasian dynamics of identity objectification and the emergence of these academic discourses in Europe, particularly in the 19th century. Now, with that in view, I always think it's interesting to throw Weber in here, because even though when you think about it, Weber isn't in any way, to me, a direct descendant of Herder, he is nevertheless working with exactly the same criteria. Language, ancestry, religion, vicinage. There's no reason, I was educated to think, well, this is all natural. Of course, this is the way people align themselves. No, there's nothing natural about it. These are the exact criteria that come out of the conquest history of the overland empires of Eurasia. Now, one of the things that's important to me about Weber is that he was so specific about the dynamism of ethnic identities as contrasted to national identities. He, unlike, I think, his representation in American academic discourse in the later 20th century, he did not tend to use terms like ethnische Gruppen. He's saying ethnische Gemeinschaft. And I think this is actually the key to this. When in Gemeinschaft is actually invoking this entire ecology of power and change and perceptions of relative positions in society that was in the earlier 20th century, middle 20th century, essential to ideas about ethnicity, that not everybody was ethnic, that ethnicity was that there was a formal, national, classical cultural base, and then ethnicity was what was at the edges of that, what was informal, what was folky, what was destined to be assimilated at some point in the future. This is, Weber, I think, was the last great formulation of this, and one that had these great echoes in American academic discourse for the greater part of the 20th century, even though by the end of the 20th century, we're getting into this other thing, which is where I want to kind of end up, which is this universalization of the ethnic concept to basically describe every single identifiable cultural group who has ever existed. And so we have now this tremendous, very late 20th century and now 21st century retrospective of universalized ethnicity. And this is very, very well developed in my own field. And I think this is very unfortunate for these reasons. We are, first of all, the emergence of this universalization of ethnicity, I think, has been for good reasons, right? It has paralleled a political shift in which we've been focusing on equality and empowerment and historical responsibility. But in universalizing ethnicity and losing that Weber's sense, right, of the ethnische Gemeinschaft, and instead universalizing this ethnicity, what has actually come to be is that the groups who, because they were in a national position, had dominated the old discourses of ethnicity, let's say specific ethnicity, they are now dominating the new discourse of universal ethnicity because now they are claiming to be ethnic. Just as a little technical illustration of this, in the case of China, in the 1950s, when the great sort of national nationalities policies were promulgated, there were 55 ethnic groups and the Han Chinese, who were the national group. So there were 55 ethnicities. Now there are 56 ethnicities in China because the Han have become an ethnic group. And so there's all kinds of ways in which this manifests in the way that people are now narrating the Qing Empire and so on. So I think the reasons for this arising are, in my view, healthy. But the outcome of it has actually, I think, is integrating with, dovetailing with this neo-essentialism that is now beginning to be very noticeable in political discourse, I mean, and outside the academy. So I think losing the ability to describe the role of power and dominance in the emergence of the concepts of ethnicity as contrasted to nationality is a distinct loss. And I think being able to, I think losing, right, this sense of ethnicity as a persisting condition of marginalization, and in many cases, a certain kind of dependency, and being narrated as contingent, right? I think in using this vocabulary of universalized ethnicity, we're just losing the ability to articulate that kind of a history. So, okay, that's what I want to say.